So I walked up the track onto the mountain, with frozen grasses crackling underfoot and with a sparkling sky over my head. There was a thin, new moon. 3 tawny owls were calling from different parts of the Cwm. The rocky summit of the mountain stood in silhouette against the northern sky, and to the south I could see a multitude of faint lights flickering from the sooty windows of the cottages and hovels of Cilgwyn. Now and then a whiff of wood smoke reached my nostrils. A dog barked at Dolrannog Isaf, and then its barking turned into a howl. I did not think this particularly strange, but then other distant sounds reached my ears, and I became aware that the hairs on the back of my neck were rising and that my pulse was quickening. I sat down on a rock near the icy spring and placed my lantern on the ground, not sure what to expect. Then, as I let my gaze wander along the far horizon, I saw a bright haze of light in the sky towards the south. At the same time, I heard hoofbeats and marching feet and bugles and drums and war chants. Far away, but getting closer. Then I realised that similar sounds were coming from the north, and when I turned, I saw that the sky behind Carningli was also lightning, with streaks of blue and green and orange, like those which we see occasionally with the gleaming of the northern lights. But I knew, with rising apprehension, that these lights were coming not from some cold northern ocean, but from a world in which time and place were confused and tangled together into some horrid knot which would bind itself around my heart. And so it proved. I could not take my eyes off the sky, and I could not cover my ears as the sky became brighter by the second, and as the sounds of marching armies drew closer. Soon, all the stars had been overwhelmed by the brightness in the sky, and the landscape around me was bathed in light. Then I saw the men, the horses, the battle standards, the shields and the weapons. 2 armies marching towards each other, intent upon slaughter and intent simultaneously upon overturning my own calm and loving little world. The Northern Army marched overhead, as if supported on some invisible bridge across the firmament, and the Southern Army halted in its tracks. Then a great shout went up, and the drum beats quickened and reached a climax. Bugles blared, riders spurred their steeds to the gallop, and the sound of marching feet was transformed into a thunderous cacophony made by running soldiers and clashing weapons, falling horses and mortally injured men, war cries and screams of agony. Armour, helmets and shields glinted as sheets of lightning flared from horizon to horizon. There were no clouds, but thunder crashed and rolled above me, disobeying all the rules of nature. Dark sweeps of arrows flashed overhead. Lances and spears were cast into the melee of struggling soldiers, and I could hear the sounds of heavy swords clashing, metal on metal, or cutting through the thin cold air and into limbs, heads, and torsos. Flails and battle axes were used to terrible effect. I saw cleaved heads and severed limbs, horses with wild eyes, struggling in their death throes on the blood-covered grass, and men insane with bloodlust, killing in order not to be killed. I watched, transfixed, until I could stand it no longer. And then I fell to the ground and buried my head beneath my cloak, shaking with terror. For minutes, or hours, in truth, I know not which, the battle continued. And then I heard a shout of triumph as the ragged remnants of one army put the other to flight. I raised my head and opened my eyes and saw horsemen and foot soldiers rush down towards some far western horizon, leaving behind them a scene of utter carnage on the battlefield. The sounds of drums and bugles faded away until the only things audible were the faint cries for help of those who still had breath for crying, and the sighs and moans of those who were sinking into the sweet oblivion of death. The bright light began to fade, and I stood up and sought to compose myself. I realised that the battle had occurred in the sky above Mynydd Morville, in exactly the same place as I had observed it some 7 years ago. I also knew that I had witnessed again, some 700 years after its occurrence, the conflict known in Wales as the Battle of Mynydd Carn, in which the forces of Treharn and Caradog of Gwynedd had fought against the armies of Gruffydd ap Cynon and Rhys ap Tewdwr. But I also knew from old Maurice Higon of Tripant, who has the misfortune to live close to the scene of the battle, that those who witness it from time to time are either blessed or cursed by what happens immediately afterwards. 7 years ago, after the battle, I watched as the sky was bathed in a white light, which enabled me to find my way in a distressed state to Mr. Higon's humble abode. He considered that in seeing such a light, I was well blessed and destined to emerge triumphant from the trials which were later to afflict me. And indeed I did emerge, on that occasion, with my faculties more or less intact, battered and bleeding, after being dragged through hell. Now I waited to see what would happen next, and as I watched, the landscape was bathed in an ethereal light which surrounded me, and even seemed to pass through me. With a cold horror which I felt in the pit of my stomach, I had to accept that the light was not white, but red. Then in a few seconds it faded away, leaving me shaking and shivering with emotion and gasping for breath beneath the gleaming stars of the January night. So this was my happy hen Galan, with my peace and serenity destroyed by awesome violence, my blanket of security and contentment ripped into shreds and replaced by the rough and garish banners of war. Not war with Napoleon and his confederates across the Channel, but war much closer to home, which would, I feared, bring my beloved family to the very edge of extinction.